Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you very much for attending today's talk. So my talk this evening is about Joanna Vassa. I've entitled it An Imagined Life. The reason I've entitled it An Imagined Life is because we really don't know very much about Joanna Vassa. Anything that I did find in my research about 14, 15 years ago was really documentary evidence about where she lived during the course of her life. Anything that was written about her was written, and it's very little that was written about her, was actually written by her husband about her. So in this talk, I'm going to refer to what I do know and what I did uncover about Joanna Vassa in the course of my research, but I'm going to really sort of situate it within broader discussions around people of mixed heritage in the 18th and 19th century, given that a lot of the information that was written about those individuals was often written by other people as well. But what you will get from this talk today is a sort of broader understanding of what it may have been like to live as a person of mixed heritage in the 19th century. And also, I will also discuss, by way of comparison, the lives of other people of mixed heritage, some other people of mixed heritage. So let's begin. So, as you know, Joanna Vassa's grave was discovered, I believe, by the scholar Vincent Coretta in Abney Park Cemetery, where she is buried with her husband, Henry Bromley, the Congregationist minister. And unfortunately, we can't be there today because of situations around COVID. But I've provided a lovely picture of that grave that is in Abney Park at the moment. So before we start with talking about Joanna Vassa, we have to give some attention to her father, Olaudah Equiano, or as he also described, named himself, he was named Gustavus Vassa, the African. So Equiano's story is quite well known, and I won't go into any sort of real detail into his life as it's already well documented. But what I will say is that Equiano's narrative in his own lifetime was published into 9 editions. It was translated into Dutch, German, and Russian, and achieved significant success in the United States. We also know that further posthumous editions appeared in the 19th century. So that suggests that certainly amongst a certain readership, certainly amongst anti-slavery readership, particularly in the United States, the name of Olaudah Equiano was still very much remembered well into the 19th century. Equiano became the first person of African descent that people thought of when they imagined a Black speaker. This is because he travelled throughout the whole of the United Kingdom, as it was then, certainly Ireland and Scotland, not only promoting his book, but involved in speaking out against the transatlantic enslavement, the trade and trafficking in Africans. In 1789, Equiano commenced his first book promotional tour. He was hoping in that tour not only to sell copies of his book, to pay for his expenses, but he was also seeking subscribers amongst its 10,000 residents in Cambridgeshire for the second edition of his autobiography. Here he was able to establish a network of subscribers who were part or represented the highest levels of political and ecclesiastical establishments in London and Cambridgeshire. So subscribers included people like the Duke of Cumberland, Countess of Harrington, Bishop of Chester, Duke of Queensberry, Mayor of London, and also Peter Peckard, who was the Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge. Two men that also are significant to the story of both Equiano and to Joanna Vassa are John Audley and Edward Inde. They were part of the Cambridgeshire gentry who were members of the Society for the Effecting of the Abolition of the Slave Trade, and they both served as co-executors of his will. So we know that Equiano was an active and successful salesman, traveling throughout the country selling his book, networking, and also creating a network of booksellers to create. So he created a very large list of local distributors. He travelled, as I said, to many cities across in England: Manchester, Sheffield, Nottingham, Halifax, um, not Newcastle, and spent much of 1791 and 1792 on the road in England, in Ireland, and Scotland, believing that he could make a greater contribution to the abolitionist cause and his own financial situation if he spent time travelling. It's likely that Equiano met Susanna Cullen on his bookselling tour in Cambridgeshire in 1789, and she was a subscriber to the third edition of his autobiography. Her parents were of moderate means, and so having Equiano as a son-in-law was actually socially a bit of a catch for them. So their marriage, because he was so well known, their marriage was announced in the London press. And after marrying Susanna, he went to Scotland to sell the fifth edition of the book. With his wife, they travelled with Susanna. He travelled to Paisley, Glasgow, and Edinburgh, and doing this tour up and through till May of 1792. And he was also combining political activity with his book selling, returning to Soham with Susanna, but soon leaving her to travel again to places London, Shrewsbury, Tewkesbury, Gloucester, Bristol, and more cities. Now, beyond documentation, little is known of their family life. We know that between his bookselling tours, he probably went back to Soham for the birth of his first child, Anna Maria, and Joanna was born on the 11th of April in 1795. Between 1793 and 1794, 4 editions of the interesting narrative appeared. Susanna died in 1796, and she left everything to Equiano. He placed the care of his children in the care of others, we believe Susanna's family, returning to London to make provision for their futures. And at the time of his own death, Equiano was probably the wealthiest African Briton living in England. Unlike the vast majority of Britons, he had enough wealth to justify writing a will. In the event of his death, as I said, he named John Audley and Edward Ind as his executors to provide, as he said in the will, for the board, maintenance, education of his daughters, until they reached the age of 21, and then they would inherit the estate and property I have dearly earned by the sweat of my brow in some of the most remote and adverse corners of the whole world. He bequeathed to them the acres of land that Susanna had left to him, if he should outlive his mother-in-law, because she left them first to her mother, along with sundry household goods and furniture, clothing and printed books, and monies amounting to around £950. Equiano died on the 31st of March 1797, and we know that much of his wealth came from his success as a self-made man, and he was a genius of self-representation and self-promotion. He made sure he had copyright to his book so he could change it and make changes to it over the various editions. And more recently, we have discovered, certainly again, Vincent Coretta and the work of the Equiano Society, they have discovered that Equiano is buried on this site. This is the American International Church, which is in Tottenham Court Road in central London. And here is an impression of the church in which Equiano married Susanna Cullen, St Andrew's Church in Soham in Cambridgeshire. A plaque was placed there in a commemoration of that union back in 2007. And here is a copy, an image of the book. So so Equiano, when he published his book, he put his African name, which is Olaudah Equiano. But in doing so, he was claiming his African identity. But when he went about his business in terms of introductions, introducing himself to different people and making his networks, many of his letters of introduction described him as Gustavus Vassa, the name that was given to him as a child when he was enslaved when he was a young man when he served in the British Navy during the 7 Years' War. I think that because he introduced himself as Gustavus Vassa and described himself as this Gustavus Vassa, the African, that's why his daughter took the name Vassa rather than calling herself Joanna Equiano. Now, unfortunately, Anna Maria, his firstborn, did not live past the age of 3 years old. It's believed that she died as a consequence of a measles epidemic that took place in Cambridgeshire in early 1797. As if you go to Cambridge in Chesterton, what you'll find is this beautiful plaque with a poem in her memory. Now, we are not sure who actually put this, had this plaque placed in her memory, but it's my feeling that because he had made significant links in Cambridgeshire, because of his marriage and because of the work that he did in Cambridge, that this plaque was placed there in her memory, not only to commemorate Anna Maria Vassa, but also to commemorate Equiano himself. I imagine it would have cost a considerable amount of money to have this plaque engraved and placed on the side of the church. Speculation is that Martha Peckard, the wife of Reverend Peter Peckard, as I said, the master of Magdalen College, may have been the person who commissioned the plaque. They say this is so because it's the poem on the plaque is similar in style to the poem she wrote on the occasion of her husband's death. And she had been known in her day as a minor poet. So this plaque dedicated to the passing of Anna Maria Vassa, who we do not know exactly where she was buried, is again suggests that Equiano and his family were clearly very highly thought of in Cambridge and very well known. So Joanna Vassa, she survived. She survived well into adulthood. And so she was probably about 12 years old when the Act to abolish the slave trade was passed in 1807. And what's also interesting is that Joanna Vassa lived in a period of very significant change, certainly and political and cultural change, especially around the issue of slavery and the slave trade. So there were quite a few landmark and significant events that happened within her lifetime. As I said, it's impossible to speculate or in terms of understanding what she may have thought about those particular events. So much of what I'm going to say now is quite speculative. But I imagine that as a young woman, she would have been told as soon as she was able to understand the legacy of her father, what he had done, the travels that he had made. She would have read his book when she was old enough to do so. So she would have known everything about her father through his writing. She would have known about her father through the people that knew her and had been taking care of her. So she would have been, I imagine, quite proud of his accomplishments. And she would have been, I imagine, very involved or very conscious of what was happening in Britain at the time she was growing up. So what I'd like to talk about now is a little bit about people growing up as mixed heritage in Britain at the time of the 18th century. So we know that many planters, slave owners, people who were in the military, particularly in the Royal Navy, would have had brought over enslaved people. We also know that many of them would have had relationships with enslaved women and had offspring as a consequence of those unions. So we know that Britain would have been, in that period, to see a person of mixed heritage would not have been so very unusual. So mixed race people would have been coming from the Caribbean to sail to England. They would have been making frequent crossings, not only the children of these slave owners and naval officers, but also their mistresses, who would have accompanied white people to Europe. So many white men took black and brown mistresses with them to Britain, a behaviour that was not at all unusual or in West Indian society, but for the most part, it did not win favour amongst Britons in the metropole, who preferred not to view such sexual transgressions carried across the divide between colony and metropole. So people of mixed race spread to the various corners of British shores, with equal amount of them going to Scotland and England. And records show that many West Indians of colour, mixed race West Indians, settled in numerous places throughout Britain, in London, Bristol and Kent, many of them attending grammar schools in Scotland and in the home counties. So there was this widespread diaspora of mixed race West Indians. And I say West Indians because they came from the West India colonies. And so this put them into contact with many Britons, indigenous, making their presence in locations large and small, tied to white families and specific schools. So they were exposed in small urban areas as well as rural centres and as well as the metropole central in London and other larger cities. And so this all contributed to a growing awareness of their existence within British society. So the picture I have up at the moment is a picture of Dido Elizabeth Lindsay. And she is really the most referenced individual of colour in 18th century Britain. She interacted with some of Britain's most elite members of society. She was born as an enslaved child to a black woman who we do not know, and Captain Jonathan Lindsay, who was of the Royal Navy. And so she was able to live a privileged life through her father's family. Her story, like Joanna Vassa's and other mixed-race women in the UK, demonstrates the opportunities of affluence and social acceptance available to some fortunate migrants of colour. However, her history reveals that there were limits under which mixed-race individuals operated in Britain. Unwilling or unable to care for Dido, Jonathan Lindsay sent her to live with his uncle, William Murray, who was the first Earl Mansfield and Chief Justice of the King's Bench. He lived at Kenwa's house in a large villa on Hampstead Heath. Dido had a job. Her job, she was responsible for supervising the Kenwood's poultry and dairy yards, and she received a £5 allowance every 3 months between the years of 1785 and 1793. Lord Mansfield also gave her money on her birthday, around £5 and 5 shillings every year. And he was very fond of her, and his generosity towards her was also well known. Thomas Hutchinson, the former governor of Massachusetts, was a guest at his home, and he remarked in one of his own letters that Mansfield has been reproached for showing a fondness for her, I dare say not criminal. I think Hutchinson's impression of Lindsay, Dido Lindsay, was that she was neither, he described her as being pert enough. She was for him neither handsome or genteel, which perhaps shows his own ambivalence at seeing a black or mixed-raced woman in an elite household in a position that was not one exactly of servant. She was neither servant nor a full member of that family. The historian Daniel Livesey, his own analysis of the painting that we have here in front of us, shows Lindsay with her cousin Lady Elizabeth Murray. And he notes that he maintains that Dido is wearing quite an outmoded dress in comparison to the very fashionable dress that Lady Elizabeth is wearing. She's in the background. She's wearing a turban, again alluding to her exoticism. She's and her Atlantic heritage. So she's occupying a very unstable position in this world, neither in it or out of it. Mansfield's relation to Lindsay is also interesting, given his involvement in two important cases involving enslavement: the Somerset case of 1772 and the Zong case of 1781. In the Somerset case, Mansfield ruled that James Somerset, the enslaved servant of one John Stuart from Massachusetts, at the time, as you know, the colonies were still part of the British Empire, he could not be removed from Britain by his owner. He could not be forcibly removed from Britain. This decision was understood certainly by many formerly enslaved people, black community in Britain, that slavery did not exist on British soil. But this wasn't exactly the case. But the response to that decision was seen by slave owners as a shocking violation of property rights. And a Jamaican planter remarked that the judgment went in Somerset's favour because Lord Mansfield keeps a black in his house, which governs him and his whole family. So at this early stage, in the early 1770s, there was a fear of the infiltration and a fear of African corruption in Britain, which loomed large in the minds of those attentive to the possibilities of abolition. Lindsay's familial connections meant that she entered adult life with some financial backing, some financial security. So in addition to a £1,000 bequest from her father, she received support from Mansfield and his wife. As the daughter of an enslaved woman, she was actually legally enslaved herself, making any inheritance problematic. Perhaps unwilling to risk any potential compromise in her inheritance, Mansfield confirmed her freedom in his will, giving her a gift of £500 and an annuity of £100. So it was clear that Mansfield had some tenderness towards Dido, requesting in his will that his portrait be placed in her room to put her in her mind of one she knew from infancy and always honoured her with uninterrupted confidence and friendship. 6 years later, his wife, Lady Margaret Murray, left her £100 as a token of her regard. So their family bonds tied the Murrays closely with Lindsay, which lasted certainly throughout their lifetime. However, after they died, she did not solidify her place within the English ranks of privilege. She was unable to maintain her affluence after the death of her great uncle and aunt. She married in 1793 to John de Vignier, who worked as a servant, and she had twin boys with him, born in 1795, the same year as Joanna Vassa. Dido de Vignier, as she was known then, died in 1804, aged 41. Her marriage to a servant compromised her status, and her dark-skinned complexion meant that it was very unlikely that she would have married into the upper ranks of society. So it impeded her marriage prospects. So consequently, her fall in fortunes was linked to the loss of family connections, lending further proof to the tenuous position of many individuals of colour in Britain. So Lindsay appears to have been less able to create a niche for herself outside the parameters of the patronage she received by the Murrays. Similarly, in terms of discussing the different experiences that people of mixed heritage had in England, we have to give some attention to Robert Wedderburn and William Davidson, who were both mixed-race Jamaicans who spoke openly about their own distance from high society. Both of them experienced difficulties in their respective professions, and both turned to religious and political radicalism. Neither benefited from familial support or social or financial networks, like many mixed-race Caribbean children of planters, merchants, and naval officers. For them, Britain was not a bastion of freedom, but rather it was a mirror of the Caribbean islands' prejudice and oppression. It's also important to bear in mind that within the early modern period, that blackness often signified colonialism. It signified the slave trade and plantation slavery. So by the 18th century, these economic systems, along with English manufacturing industries that had begun to operate within this profitable interlocking network, gave rise to racist ideas, transmitted largely through the written word, and with their foundations in economic and political justifications. So the writer Peter Fryer, he notes that racism crystallized in print in Britain in the 18th century as the ideology of plantocracy, the class of sugar planters and slave merchants that dominated England's Caribbean colonies. So both Wedderburn and Davidson are interesting because they both lobbied for political reform. They both were radical political reformers in Britain, and their presence in the working class radicalisms of 19th century Europe went beyond state and imperial borders. So you can really describe them as sort of proto-socialists in the 1810s, which and their activism sort of incorporated aspects of 18th century anti-slavery movement, which was a tactic that appealed to the metropole's population of colour. London's black and mixed race communities became politically active in progressive and reactionary ways. For example, people of colour were actually part of the mob in 1780 during the Gordon riots, which was a riot which attacked parliamentary concessions to that attacked the parliamentary concessions that were given to Catholics. And so West Indians of colour, they aligned their own experience of racial oppression with wider appeals for economic and social justice. So both Davidson and Wedderburn were victims of metropolitan inequality and used their own histories of oppression to advocate radical change. Now, Robert Wedderburn, whose father was a planter, a prominent planter in Jamaica, disowned his son. He would not accept him as his son. So living in Jamaica as a young man, he found himself in between two worlds. He was not an enslaved child, but he was consistently witnessed to the horrors of enslavement within a slave society, and chose to escape from that horrors by joining the Royal Navy and eventually settling in central London, where he often found himself the victim of discrimination. And it was there that he got very much involved in Spencean Spencean thought and politics and became a radical preacher, if you will, but who was often under surveillance by the British government. In turn, William Davidson, who was also born in Jamaica, decided to move to Britain to first. He received some help from his father, but was unable. And the argument is, it's suggested by historians, because of discrimination, was unable to find sustainable work. He trained as a cabinet maker, and eventually up in Edinburgh was impressed into the Navy, and eventually found himself living in South London for a time. And because of his own experiences of discrimination, he was also attracted to the radical thought and activities that were happening in early 19th century England, and was part of reading societies that he held in his own home. He was arrested in 1820. Now, all these groups were all infiltrated by spies. So his own group was infiltrated by government spies who fed them erroneous information about the British cabinet being having dinner one evening, and it said that they should go there and assassinate the British cabinet. This was all false information. It was like a trap, and where Davidson was caught, where they kept their weapons. He made the claim during his trial that often he was mistaken because of discrimination. He was also often accused of crimes that he had not committed, and made the claim that he was actually not guilty of being involved in this conspiracy, because people often felt that all Black people, especially Black men, they looked the same, so that he was also often being the victim of mistaken identity. So their experiences, both Wedderburn's experiences and Davidson's experience, were vastly different from the experience, for example, of Dido, Lindsay, and vastly different from the experience of other mixed-race West Indians, who often did receive the patronage and support of their fathers to attend schools and to live lives which people would consider lives of success. So Joanna Vassa, the last surviving daughter of Olaudah Equiano, was living in this particular period. And again, as I said, it's very difficult to really say with any certainty what her thoughts were about what her experiences were, I should say, as a woman of colour. But what we can say is that her situation was quite unusual. Normally, it was the father, the white father, the planter, the merchant, the naval officer who sired these children and decided to recognise them and to offer them support. Joanna Vassa was in a very interesting position because her father, who was an African, had married an English woman. That in itself wasn't particularly unusual. There were lots of people, Black men living in Britain at the time, who married white English women. But what was interesting was that Equiano was a very wealthy, self-made man who had married a woman of modest means. So her position was quite interesting. She was neither exactly a member of the upper echelons of British society, but neither was she. But she wasn't exactly she wasn't a lower class person either. Also, the people who supported her outside of her family were members of sort of the landed gentry. As I said, her executor, particularly John Audley, who was very much a part of her life, certainly up until she got married, was a member of Cambridgeshire landed gentry. So she was in an interesting position. So it's likely that Joanna, who was orphaned at the age of 2, was brought up in Cambridgeshire by her mother's family and was probably in regular contact with John Audley, the executor. So available evidence does not reveal whether Joanna considered herself or was considered by others as a woman of colour. We do not know what she looked like. We just don't. So we know that there was ambivalence about colour combined with attitudes towards the gender, which contribute to what the literary scholar Felicity Nussbaum describes as the politics of complexion. So in the absence of evidence from Joanna Vassa herself on how she described or identified herself, she seems to have been like other women of African and European heritage, classified as neither black nor white. So growing up in the late Georgian and Regency period, Joanna would have been part of a privileged group of mixed race people. Again, we do not know to what extent that privilege extended. She received white patronage. She had family assistance and financial support necessary for success. She was, for all intents and purposes, an heiress with social mobility, and as such would have received an education fitting that class. So certainly when she became of age in 1816, 7th of April of 1816, she turned 21 and received her inheritance. And we know that Equiano had left her £950, which in today's money is something around £100,000. So she was a very eligible young woman. At the year that she turned 21 was also the year that there was a significant rebellion in Barbados called Buss's Rebellion. And this rebellion was very much highly and well publicized in the British press. And it was, some say it was the rebellion came about as a consequence of discussions that were happening in Britain at the time. Now, what was happening in Britain at the time was that the parliamentary abolitionists, led by William Wilberforce, were having discussions about trying to make sure that slavery, because by this time the slave trade had been abolished, but there was an illegal slave trade that was happening. And to try to curb the illegal slave trade that was happening, Wilberforce was introducing a bill called the Registration Act. Now, the Registration Act was kind of like a census. It meant that all slave owners in the Caribbean had to register their enslaved people on a regular basis, say on a 4 or 5 year basis, to make sure that anybody who was being named who wasn't born to an enslaved person, who was a child born to an enslaved person. So if somebody came into was in possession, an enslaved person was an enslaved person that there was not present in the earlier registration, that could cause problems for that slave owner. So the situation was that slave owners were absolutely furious that they were having to be told by the imperial government how to run colonial affairs. And this would have been discussed quite openly amongst within the British Caribbean. And it is argued that those discussions were listened to and heard by the enslaved, and consequently a rebellion then ensued. So again, Joanna Vassa would have been conscious of what was going on, but unfortunately we cannot even speculate about what she would have thought or felt about that particular event. Sorry. So this is again. This is an image in 1819, and I just want to oh God, I've lost my notes on that. Sorry, bear with me. So in 1819, Cruikshank made a satirical cartoon that you see here that he entitled the New Union Club cartoon. And it was a very complex print. It purports to show a dinner held at the African Institution. Now, the African Institution was established after the abolition of the slave trade, and it was founded by William Wilberforce and other abolitionists, parliamentary abolitionists, and other people who are other abolitionists, with the view to work on making sure that slave trading wasn't going to happen in Sierra Leone and other West African countries. So it was also another way to lobby government about making sure that the slave trade, which was legally illegal, by law it was illegal, trying to make sure that it was stamped out completely. So the African Institution had a dinner where it invited several people, mixed race heritage, and they were toasting to the health of King Henri of Haiti. And Cruikshank took this image and to show that becomes more drunken and debauched as the evening progresses. And in it, he really employs many common 19th century stereotypes of Black people, which included drunkenness, aggressiveness, and sexual promiscuity, and was lampooning the idea that Black people could aspire to be like white people. And so the reason why I've put this image up is, again, this is 1819. This is within the period that Joanna Vassa was alive, and she would have been seeing these types of images. So in 1821, Joanna Vassa gets married. She gets married at the parish of Church of St. James in Clerkenwell, and she marries one Henry Bromley, who was a Congregationist minister. Henry Bromley was born in 1798 in Islington and came from a family with long-established nonconformist links. Now, it's not clear how they met, but it's likely that possibly somebody like John Audley would have thought it would be a good marriage, a good match, if Joanna married somebody like a minister. And so he, as I said, he was a Congregationist, and no doubt that Joanna would have attended church as a child because her father was also a very religious man. He was a Methodist. So in June of 1821, Bromley was ordained as a minister in the Independent Chapel of Appledore. And I think it was likely he would have known who Equiano was, most certainly. And would have, again, as I said, we do not know how these two came to meet. But 2 months after he was ordained, in August of that same year, he married Joanna at St. James's Church in Clerkenwell in London. The witnesses to that marriage were John Audley and Catherine Bromley, Henry's sister. And during the time she was living in London, listed as being from the parish of St. James, either she could have been living with Catherine Bromley or with relatives of Audley. Because he was present at the wedding, it suggests that he might have been quite involved in her life, certainly more than just the executor of her father's will. So, as I said, Henry Bromley was a Congregationalist minister. And just to show you some more of the sort of complications of the complications in Britain in terms of slavery and the slave trade, I discovered that his brother was a solicitor for and was a trustee for the Bide Mill plantation in Barbados. And in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership records, I learned that he was awarded £1,582 for the enslaved people on that plantation. And this is their family home in Suffolk. So Henry and Joanna Bromley, as she was now known, they lived in Appledore, Devon, until 1826 or 1827. Again, there's very little in the church records that gives a sense of what kind of pastor he was. There's no information at all about Joanna and anything that she may have been involved in. But we do know that in 1823, the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery was founded. We also know that in 1823, George Canning, in response to a series of proposals of amendments in Parliament, came up with some amendments of his own in regarding the state of what was going to happen to the enslaved populations in the British Caribbean. They were calling for abolition, in gradual abolition, and George Canning agreed with this, that it should be gradual, which was quite, most slave owners were quite happy with that proposal, because it meant that gradual could mean anything. It could go on, gradual abolition could go on. The argument was that the enslaved population had to be prepared for abolition, and over time, which would include religious instruction. It would include other series of reforms that would help them to prepare themselves for freedom. So in 1824, in response to this idea of gradual abolition, the pamphlet Immediate and Not Gradual Abolition was published by the abolitionist Elizabeth Hayrick. And she wrote, as I said, she wrote it in response to these 1823 resolutions passed in Parliament that countered abolitionist demands. And in her pamphlet, Hayrick argued passionately in favour of immediate emancipation of the enslaved population in the British Caribbean, which differed greatly from the Anti-Slavery Society's position of gradual abolition, which now Hayrick attacked that policy as slow, cautious and accommodating, the very masterpiece, she wrote, of satanic policy. And she called for a boycott of sugar produced on slave plantations. Most male abolitionists were attempted to suppress this pamphlet and the existence of this pamphlet, because in this time, as you can imagine, they were unable to justify the idea of women involved in politics. And despite the fact that women made up 10% of, provided 10% of financial contributions to their organisation. So consequently, in April 1825, when Joanna Vassa was living in Devon, Lucy Townsend and other women decided to form the Birmingham Ladies Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves, promoting the boycott on sugar, not only targeting shops, but also targeting those who were purchasing the sugar. They distributed pamphlets calling for meetings, and they drew up petitions. and it was completely independent of the Anti-Slavery Society and local men's groups. And women's groups were also set up all across the country after the Birmingham's organisation was set up. So in Nottingham, in Sheffield, Leicester, Glasgow, Norwich, London, Darlington, and Chelmsford. So by 1831, 73 of women's organisations were campaigning against slavery. It's nice to sort of think that Joanna Vassa was part of a women's anti-slavery society. It's nice to think that she either joined one or perhaps created one herself. But unfortunately, there is no evidence to suggest that she did. As I said, her voice is completely absent from the narrative about her, and anything that was written about her is written by her husband. Similarly, in 1823, again, when she was living in Devon, the Demerara revolt in 1823 took place. And it's argued that the source and the reasons for that significant rebellion in 1823 was because of the discussions being had in Parliament that were being discussed also in Demerara, which is present-day Guyana. Because Demerara was a crown colony. It wasn't like Jamaica or Barbados, which had their own colonial assemblies. It was ruled directly from London, which meant that it was used as a test case, if you will, in terms of trying to implement they were never implemented, but they wanted to use Demerara as the test case to see if they could implement these kinds of ameliorative reforms that would eventually mean that enslaved people would be gradually prepared for emancipation. As you can expect, the planters within Demerara were extraordinarily resistant to this idea. And again, it is argued by some historians that these discussions that were being openly had in front of the enslaved populations led some of them to believe that emancipation was coming and that it was being withheld from the enslaved population, and consequently they rebelled and revolted. So again, this is another significant event happening within the lifetime of Joanna Vassa, and something she would have read about and been conscious of. And again, unfortunately, we simply just do not know what her own thoughts were on these tumultuous events. So in 1827, both Joanna and Henry Bromley moved to Clavering in Essex. So they moved in 1827 and were there for almost 20 years until 1845. They stayed there until 1845. And we know that it was a successful pastorate for Bromley. He wrote a book on the Congregational Church there, and he was also involved in various societies in the area, and he's recorded as being a regular attending member of the Clavering Reading Society from 1827 until 1845. Again, no records of her being a member of this society, but she was a subscriber to the Sunday school and remained so until they left Clavering in 1845. What happened in 1845 is that she, again, this is a letter that Henry Bromley wrote in his letter of resignation to his congregation, that something had happened. He said, "I feel that Mrs. Bromley's health is in a very seriously suffering from the injurious influence of the situation as connected with the peculiar state of her constitution. And the fear I entertain that passing another winter here would be so severe, some complaints from which she suffers, as to render their removal afterwards very difficult, if not impossible." And again, I could not find what he was referring to. I could not find what she was referring to, but this was the reason he gave um, for his resignation, that she had some serious health issues. Um, we do not know if that's sort of code for mental health issues. It's really, again, it's so tantalizing, and it's such a mystery. It's a mystery as to what that actually meant. Was she experiencing, for example, racism within the church? Was she being discriminated against? It's really, again, all very speculative. A significant thing that happened in her lifetime, I'll just tap on, was the Baptist Rebellion of 1831 to 32, which happened in St. James's Parish of Jamaica, and was such a serious rebellion, which caused over £1 million damage to plantations in that part of Jamaica. Was so serious that it was actually one of the catalysts, one of the reasons why slavery was eventually abolished in the British Caribbean, with the Emancipation Act being passed in 1833, but with a 5-year apprenticeship tacked on to that. So slavery was actually not abolished until 1838. So Joanna Vassa was living through this period, this very, very, very um, uh, tumultuous period in relation to enslaved people fighting to determine their own futures, to overthrow enslavement. And it's, again, given her heritage, it's I imagine she would have been extremely excited, but again, we just simply just don't know. We do not know um, what she thought. We know that she moved to Suffolk, staying with Bromley's family while he was working as the secretary of the Provident Society for the Widows of Dissenting Ministers, commonly known as the Widows Fund. They did not live together again. And sometime in the 1850s, she moved back to London. No evidence of Henry living with her. Um, and she she's listed as living in 21 Benyon Terrace, Buckingham Road in Hackney at the time of her death. And she is recorded as dying of uterine disease in 1857, which could have been either brought on by endometriosis or fibroids or cancer. Again, we do not know, but we know that Bromley was not present when she died, and we do not know whether they had children. There's no record that she did, but we do know that Henry Bromley certainly outlived her by 20 years, and after he died, he was in fact buried with her in that buried with her. So again, all I have are more questions than answers. Was she involved in the anti-slavery movement? Did she keep copies of her father's narrative? I think she did. Did she have a difficult life because of mixed heritage? And we know that certainly attitudes towards race were very hardened as a consequence of many different factors. For example, the revolution in Haiti, that frightened a lot of people to the point that the revolution in Haiti actually stopped the campaign. It halted the campaign for the abolition of the slave trade for many years, for 8 or 9 years. Until sort of 1806, when they started discussing it again in Parliament. So all of these things, these fears of infiltration, these fears that enslaved people of Black African people would run over the country, affect racial purity in England, these were all very popular ideas that were being disseminated at the time. Again, we do not know if her and Henry Bromley were happy together, whether they had a happy marriage. But we do know that her options were limited. We know that as a woman, her voice was not heard. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, so are the questions in the chat? Can I see them all there? All right, let me check. So the first question is, why do you think it took so many years for her death, for Miss Vassa's grave to be discovered and commemorated? Um, well, as I said, I know that Vin Coretta was the person who was looking for it, and I think that he was looking for it in conjunction with his own research around looking for his research on his own biography on Equiano. But often, sometimes it's very difficult. These records are very difficult to read or be found. So that's possibly one reason that it took such a long time. Maybe, and also I think one of the reasons is because the information on Joanna Vassa is so thin on the ground that they may not have even known about her until somebody else like Vince Coretta started researching, and that's when there probably was a much more renewed interest. I know from my own recollection that when I was commissioned to write the history of Joanna Vassa, I think it was about that time, 2007, around about 2006, that that this discovery came about, and so I was informed a lot by Vin Coretta's work. So I think that's a reason why. I don't know if it's the reason why, but it's a possible reason. The second question here says, on Joanna Vassa's Wikipedia page, it says has not been discovered whether she had any children. Is it usual to be unable to find this information about the doctor of a well-known man? Okay, so as I said, it's unknown whether she had children, but I imagine if she had had children. So Henry Bromley outlived her by 20 years. I'm fairly certain that he would have made some reference to his child that he had by her. I think it's unlikely that they probably did not have any children together. As I said in my talk, he was the one that said that they had to leave because of her health. She never spoke on that herself. So everything that we know about through Henry Bromley comes from Henry Bromley about Joanna Bromley. So I think he was very conscious. I think he knew who she was. He knew that Joanna Vassa was the daughter of Olaudah Equiano, because certainly in religious circles they would have known. But certainly his fame did continue amongst people well beyond his own passing. The next question is, was Lord Mansfield, I was talking about the same one from the Zong incident? Yes, it was. It was the same Lord Mansfield. Do you think Dido married a servant because the colour of her skin restricted her marital options in the late 18th century? Yes, I do. I also think that. I think it would have been very unlikely that she would have been able to have married up into the higher social echelons of it would have, because as I said in the talk, she was in neither world. She was not placed in she existed in neither world. She was neither exactly a member of the upper class elite, but she wasn't exactly a servant either, because she was, certainly she was treated very well by the Murrays. They were very fond of her. They cared about her. They cared about what happened to her. But it wasn't so much a lot was out of their hands in terms of social mobility and who would have fallen in love with her to marry her. So I think it was, like you said, her options were very limited. The next question: when you explained that mixed race West Indians became a more familiar diaspora across Britain around the period, could you give more details about the numbers? I can't give you exact details about the numbers. I was informed in that part of the talk by the historian Daniel Livesey, who wrote his thesis about mixed race people of mixed race in Britain. He doesn't give us exact numbers, but what he does say that because it would have been a total, it would not have been unusual to have seen mixed race people because they would have been in society certainly because of their fathers mainly. They were able to, and this is through looking through, he would have examined lots of correspondence, lots of letters that people would have written to each other. And that's how he would have found out his information about those individuals. But as I said in the talk, lots of them were attending schools, grammar schools, or being privately educated, had private tutors, and a lot of them actually worked for places like the East India Company. He writes about young mixed race men who got jobs in the East India Company, leaving Britain because of discrimination, thinking, for example, that because they were of mixed race heritage, that living in other parts of the world, they would have been more accepted. Where and when how do you imagine Joanna received an education? I think Joanna's education, she would have been probably privately educated, would have had a governess or somebody come in to educate her on things that young Regency women would have had to learn, which is probably learn a musical instrument, possibly piano. She would have perhaps learned a language. She would have definitely have learned how to sort of what do they call it? How to comport herself in social gatherings. That kind of education is the thing. And definitely she would have been reading a lot, journaling a lot. I sort of hoped that I would have found a journal that she'd written. Maybe one day by chance I'll find something. I did spend a little time in Suffolk, where she spent some part of her life in Suffolk looking through car boot sales, maybe to find something, but I never did. Were women involved in the African institution? They would have been subscribers, most definitely. Would they have been decision makers? No, they would not have been. Would you have expected there to be more documentation about Joanna and Henry than there was? Yes, I did. Actually, I had anticipated I would have found much more. I would have found, I went to, there's a library in Gordon Square called Dr. Williams Library, and it's the library for all ministers, congregation ministers. All their information is kept there. And I did find biographies of Henry Bromley, and his biography, his line on Joanna Vassa was literally one line, and that line was, he was married to Joanna Vassa, daughter of Gustavus Vassa the African, of who is still very well remembered. So that was his obituary, and that was it. That was all that was there. So the information, and I scoured. I went to Devon. I looked through the records of the church he was there. I went to Essex and looked at the records of the church that they stayed at for 19 years, and there was just so little personal information. That's all the questions.